Well, let's start off with this. Welcome to the Port Huron statement again. What I would like to discuss today is the universe as a simulation. This theory of the universe being a simulation. Now, I've heard this bubbling for the past year, and though it is an interesting thought experiment to consider the possibility of reality being in fact a simulation, the first thing we need to recognize is that in any adequately complex simulation, from the perspective of that simulation, you could never have a certainty beyond 50% that you are in a simulation. And certainly having a jerk-off billionaire tell you that the odds of it not being a simulation are 1 in billions is no added certainty to the likelihood that we're in a simulation. As a matter of fact, making the assumption that this is in fact a simulation, even 50% is, to say billions is so incredibly naive. It just, of course, that's what certain people think, because, in fact, the idea, Elon Musk, the idea that it's 1 billion, that this isn't a simulation, that is, in fact, a Psy-Op more than it is true. To imply that it's 1 billion is just so incredibly naive. You do understand that our reality is predicated upon an 8-dimensional Octonian number set that populates a series of probability fields that then are assigned mass through the Higgs field. This is not suggesting a simulation. The number of inherent paradoxes that are present in the fabric of space-time, not just the fabric of it. When you examine scales in space-time, you start to acknowledge that there are paradoxes of scale. One that I like to point out is the inertial frame paradox, the fact that light has this maximum speed in an inertial frame, so it can only go locally light speed. That's the maximum, but relativistically you can have faster than light speeds, even though there are no inertial frames, because, relativity guarantees us that there are no inertial frames, except for in the special case of light. So these types of paradoxes are inherent in our reality, but they very much so do not suggest a simulation. To incorporate that degree of uncertainty and inherent paradox, and to imply that that would be in a simulation, is to miss fucking point completely. It's a self-emergent number system. It can't be a simulation, and if it is a simulation, its being a simulation is in no way to the detriment of its complexity or its reality. But again, the fact that our universe is self-manifesting and emergent in a way that also emerges multitudes of paradoxes, that doesn't imply a simulation. That implies reality. Why does it imply reality? You would not need to incorporate paradoxes in order to manifest the general, real, lived experience that we have. As a matter of fact, it would almost seem more logical if it didn't have these paradoxes. You would never incorporate these paradoxes, and also because these paradoxes seemingly have no observational limit. Therefore, we even further suggest that we are not in a simulation. Then we can go even deeper and look into the elements of quantum mechanics that suggest that I mean, which part of quantum mechanics do we want to look at? And that's the thing is this, they suggest all different types of things that are very relevant to reality, but they are limited in their scale and in some aspects. Remember that the classical scale, the scale that we observe mostly, is really a coefficient of infinities, and so the way that it moves is not quantized, but once you get into small enough scales, it becomes quantized. And further, your perception is changed and altered and corrupted by the very nature of the anatomy of it. And to even be aware of the image that's being cast against your optical, or well, I should say the opsin and the retina and the rhodopsin and cascading through the optical nerve and all that, the complexity that requires the awareness of this image, I guess, to be aware of the image. So you have the complexity to be aware of the subjective element of the image. That is to say that the pure image has a lot of optical noise and other elements like, it's flipped upside down and all these other things. Your brain is doing a lot to make the image more discernible, though that is also corrupting the pure image, but it's making it closer to accurate to real life. But I guess inherent in that is occasional error. Sometimes as I remember, past really tight to your center of vision, that's all assumed color. Your brain just throwing the color in there based on what it had already seen. So there's a lot of what you're observing that isn't objectively real, and nothing of what you're observing is truly objectively real, but it's the closest thing you could imagine to being objective, whatever. The purpose of that is to create an understanding that while there is no objective observed reality, there is an objective reality. And that objective reality is the culmination of such an immense number of an emergent parallel to mathematical manifestations that really defy the bounds of a simulation. There are, just far too, gravity itself is most likely to describe it efficiently, an emergent property of the initial sort of environs of the Big Bang, or whatever we want to call it past. It doesn't have to be necessarily the Big Bang. Essentially, the initial inertias and the very nature of the matter itself in the near vacuum of space can and will coalesce around mass. This doesn't necessitate a graviton, and so once you accept that gravity essentially is an emergent property of the large numbers at play, then embracing the concept that communication itself is one as well is an easy step to take. And then it becomes easier to understand why someone would want to convince you that the world is a simulation. The world as a simulation really works for a lot of exploitive worldviews and to not only justify them but enable them. The world or the universe as a simulation really lends a lot of credence to this sort of gamification of life and the notion that it's about the high score. Essentially, these billionaires are convincing themselves and others that the higher score they have when they die, the greater when they wake up in the actual reality, the greater they will be lauded for being an outrageous asshole in some game. That's apparently what they want to win. Got to get that high score so that we win in this simulation, so that we come out of the simulation and realize that the accumulation of money was really just a determinant of how much of a piece of shit you are. I mean, what else could it possibly be? If this is a simulation, what? There is no meritocratic basis for the accumulation of money right now. So the idea that this is a simulation asterisk that also values the accumulation of wealth as the singular quantifier of human value, I mean, it's a laughable series of conclusions, But that's not the only way that it's twisted. It's also twisted as a manipulation of loyalty through a couple other Psy-Ops that I've come to discover. And Psy-Op is the best way to describe it, a psychological operation, meaning that it is a it is a lie that's being perpetuated with the assistance of slivers of truth or slivers of believability, probability, some type of likelihood or some type of credibility, and then perpetuated with a lot of appeal to authority and just a lot of yeah, presence the message. Repetition makes right. And so by creating these mechanisms of ethical hijacking, so by by altering people's understanding of what the rules are and what the goals are to the very life and reality they exist in, is a very, very powerful tool in exploitation and manipulation. And to convince people specifically that this is a simulation is extremely powerful. And it can be used hand in hand with an enormous number of other exploitation paradigms. And it's important to be aware of these because ultimately, a lot of what you're being told and what's being perpetuated is being told to you and perpetuated because there is an exploitation behind it. Essentially, we are hitting this point in capitalism where unless there is a financial incentive to perpetuate a concept, it is hardly ever going to be perpetuated. There are a couple people that are interested in perpetuating something close to objective truth in order to therefore construct a more advantageous future. The fact of the matter is altruism as a concept that is applicable in almost any avenue is always representing better outcomes than would otherwise be predicted. And there are great examples in sports, and because sports dominate a lot of people's thinking at this juncture, and it represents the major cultural exchange and platform by which people of different socioeconomic backgrounds do in fact engage, so using sports is apt. So it's also a major distraction mechanism. But in sports, we see over and over again that if we have a good collective and altruistic goal, so if rather than playing for individual glory stats, whatever, you're actually playing with a team mentality, you continually to get better outcomes than would be predicted by the anticipation of the skill of the individual players. This Tigers team, even this Lions team, embody this, and there are a lot of other examples like the Royals last year, and professional sports is probably better in amateur sports, frankly. But any time that you are in a collaborative environment, and it doesn't even need to be the same business goals or even the same goals at all, collaboration will always result in a substantially better outcomes. Collaboration enhances the emergent possibility of everything you're doing. This is the very foundation, the concept of communication as a dimension, because it is the best way to consider it. It's just, that's why the language model, by having ever more complex ideas represented in phrases, just language phrases, all these relationships keep building up and building up until they actually have meaning, not just words, they're actually meaningful to the point where the model can be creative and come up with new ideas because it understands these ideas based on their relationship to others. But remember, there's no inertial frame, especially in the realm of communication. And so then we get even further into the concept, and this is interesting because the AI has added a little bit to the concept of communication as dimensionality, and proposing the notion that some of these strange paradoxes in quantum mechanics and like the behavior of light, we could start thinking, instead of them movement as in a classical physics sense, communication is actually a better term to represent how light moves in the universe. Although this was actually literally a suggestion in the back and forth of of rounding out this theory and testing the internal logic of it using a couple different artificial intelligence platforms. This was suggested to me by Hal, by GPT. I do like GPT the most. Um, yeah, that you could suggest, or that there may be a suggestion there that um, some of these things that are thought of as movements should be more thought of as perhaps communications. Um, uh, which it's an interesting concept. I hadn't really thought of it necessarily like that. I think of it more so in the terms of the emergent possibilities that have continually proven themselves within the communicative paradigm. That is, life replicates, then it eventually, it's adapting. So there's multiple elements of anticipation and prediction, not just within the organism, but also within the replicating system of the organism. So that the genetics, especially when you have um, sexual reproduction, because then you're adding multiple different layers into not just the replication but the adaptation. And when you times this by so many different iterations, and you get ever more complex and complex, um, you know, organizations, entities, etc. Eventually we land on where we are now as just human beings, which human beings have the capacity for adequate internal complexity to where it represents a true universe worth of possibilities, coefficients of infinity, many coefficients of infinity. Just to coordinate your body, it takes coefficients of infinity, but to have like the real coordination of thought and presence of mind and awareness that you can have, really will grow your potential in every conceivable way. But also, the more we become cooperative as a species, generally, the more we can realize together a better existence, one that is more conscious, one that is more comfortable, one that is more meaningful. So the world is not a simulation, or I should say the universe is not a simulation. Now, that isn't to say that the world or the universe isn't dominated by simulacra, which is to say the manipulated representation of the objective world. There is a simulation or simulacrum being imposed on the world through the media. And I don't prescribe to the idea that media is bad, but certain types of control of the media and manipulation of it will manipulate your core perceptions of reality, and that's what the simulacrum is. It's not that reality itself is a simulation. It's that the media creates a simulated reality, a simulacrum, that then replaces reality itself in your mind, which makes you very vulnerable to exploitation and manipulation.